Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishnah Erevin, Perek Zayin, chapter 7, Mishnah Ches, Mishnah 8. Okay, so now this Mishnah is finally the moment you've been waiting for about how much food has to be contributed towards the Shituf Mavuos. And the truth is, the same halacha applies to an Erev Chatzeres. Kamahu Shiurai. What is the amount of food required for a Shituf? And again, and for an Erev Chatzeres. Bizman Shem Reuben. When you have a lot of people, you know how many a lot is? 18 or more. When you have a lot of people, the amount of food for 2 meals for everyone. That means the amount of food that one person would eat in 2 meals, that is how much food you need to cover everyone that's part of this shituf.
You don't need 18.
Exactly. Now, and Bartanura says that the amount of 2 meals is what's called 18 grey, 18 dried figs. It's a volume. So that is the amount that you need, no matter how many people you have after 18, no matter how many people you have. This amount of 2 meals suffices for everyone. And even though we say everybody is supposed to have a portion here, which could come out that if you have a lot of people, everyone has a minuscule amount. Doesn't make a difference. When you hit that amount of 18, then already we say that covers everyone. Bizman shein muatin, if you have a few people, which means less than 18, then each person has to have the amount of a dried fig, of food, of ownership of food here in this shituf, which is the amount that you'd be liable for carrying on Shabbos. When we were learning Shabbos and we were learning the Malach of Haitzah, of transferring from a public domain to private domain, vice versa, or 4 cubits in a public domain. So we had we had a number of Mishnayos that talked about what's the minimum amount of certain things to be liable for. You take out a drop of something, you're not liable from the Torah for that. Many different things have different sizes. When it comes to food, the size of the food to be liable for the act of Haitzah and Shabbos is the Shir Gregeris, the amount of a dried fig. That amount that makes you liable for transferring on Shabbos, for carrying on Shabbos, that's the amount that you have to have in the Shituf Mavuos or in the Erev Chatzeres that allows you to carry between the courtyards and the alleyway. Okay, so that's the first Mishnah. That's our first Mishnah. Now, Mishnah Tes. Amar Rabbi Yossi said. Now, just as a quick introduction, as I said before, what we just learned in this Mishnah Ches applies both to a Shituf Mavuos to an Erev Chatzeres. And if you recall, a couple of days ago, we spoke about by a Shituf Mavuos, what happens if before Shabbos the amount of food that you're supposed to have gets less than the minimum. So you have to add more food onto it. The same thing applies by an Erev Chatzeres. If the amount of food becomes less before Shabbos, you have to make sure you add more food onto it. So now Rabbi Yossi in the next Mishnah is coming to argue on one point. Amar Rabbi Yossi said, when do we say this? And when do we say that you have to have this amount that we just mentioned? Betchilas Erev, at the beginning of the Erev. And here Erev means Erev Chatzeres, because that's his main point of discussion here for Rabbi Yossi. When you're first making your Erev Chatzeres, then you have to have the amount mentioned in the previous Mishnah. But let's say we're talking about what's left over from the Erev, meaning the amount got diminished. You're supposed to have, let's say, 2 meals worth. Before Shabbos, it comes out that it's less. Like we said, you can use it from one Shabbos to another as long as it stays, its amount remains. So now it comes out that you realize that the minimum amount was decreased. Says Rabbi Yossi, then you don't have to do anything. Just leave it. You have to start with the minimum amount mentioned in the previous Mishnah. But if it comes to a point that it gets less, you don't got to add more to it. By an Erev Chatzeres. Why is that? Because they only said, meaning the sages only said, to make an Erev Chatzeres when you also made a Shituf Mavuos, only to make sure that the children don't forget about Erev Chatzeres. That means like this. He said a lot in a few words. we've been discussing Erev Chatzeres, which means you want to carry from the houses to the courtyard, you got to make an Erev Chatzeres. You want to or for the courtyard into the house. You want to carry from the courtyards, number of courtyards open to an alley. You want to carry from the courtyards to the alley or the alley to the courtyards, you got to make a shituf. Now, theoretically, if I already made a shituf mavuos, if now all the chatzeres now combined together to use the alleyway, right? So now that they did that, they're all considered one. It's like everybody's all together in one area, and every area is considered all one. So once you do that, do you need to do something for your chatzer? You shouldn't need to, because the whole point is always to combine everyone, to make everybody together, to make all the domains together. If you've already done that on a larger scale of the courtyards to the alleyway, there's really no reason to have to do that from the courtyards to the houses. Nonetheless, the Chachamim said, the sages said, that even if I do a shita for the alleyway, I still have to do a separate erev for each chatzah has to do its own erev for the houses and the courtyard. Why is that? And that the Mishna says is so that the children don't forget. When you make a shita for the mavoi, so as we said, all the food stays in one house, in one of the chatzeres, and then all the courtyards can now use the alleyway. So basically, the shituf, that which we use to make the shituf, is stored in one house in one of the chatzeres. And all the other chatzeres, there is nothing changed. No one sees anything happen.
There's nothing visible.
There's nothing visible. Mm-hmm. So the children are going to start thinking that in a courtyard, you can carry between your courtyard and your house without doing anything, because they're not going to realize that the shituf was made. And therefore, in order for that mistake not to be made, the Chachamim said, even though you shouldn't need to make the Erev Chatzeres if you made the shita for the alleyway, nonetheless, you got to do it. So Rabbi Yossi says, being that the whole reason when you've already made a shituf, that you have to make an Erev Chatzeres is in order to make sure the children, you really don't need it, but it's so that the children don't forget there's such a thing as an Erev Chatzeres. Therefore, once your minimum amount becomes decreased, we can be lenient. We can be lenient in that situation. That's what Rabbi Yossi says. That's what Rabbi Yossi means when he says that at the beginning of making the Erev Chatzeres, you got to have the minimum amount. But if it decreases, the sages didn't obligate you to do more because you really don't need it. And the only reason we're doing it here is to make sure the children don't forget. And therefore, in the situation where it decreased, you don't got to add anything more to it. That's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. We don't pass like that. The halacha is like the previous Mishnah that didn't make that differentiation, and therefore, whether it's a shita for your mavoi, whether it's an erev for your chatzar, even when you made a shituf and you're only making the erev so as not to have the children forget, if the amount becomes decreased, you have to add more to it before Shabbos. Have a wonderful day, wonderful Shabbos, good Chodesh.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.